Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for all your participation and engagement in the morning and first afternoon session. Now going to move into the keynote address, and so I'll start with a brief introduction. This summer, as we were planning the theme for this year's conference, I was reading in the news about a UN report on poverty and human rights in the United States. U.S. Ambassador to the UN at the time, Nikki Haley, said it was, quote, patently ridiculous for the United Nations to examine poverty in the U.S. We disagree. And we decided to focus the conference on poverty and inequality on addressing this UN report. And as we brainstormed content this summer, we thought, what if the author of the report was the keynote speaker? Who better could address the report than the person who wrote it and responded to the then Ambassador Haley directly? So we're really thrilled to have Philip Alston here to deliver our keynote address, Human Rights and the American Dream. And as you listen to his speech, I want you all to remember the words Langston Hughes wrote in 1935 that we included on the front of our program. And those are, "Oh, let America be America again, the land that has never been yet and yet must be." So I'll now introduce Professor Alston, of course, here. Some of you might have heard this morning, so bear with me. Philip Alston teaches international law, international criminal law, and a range of human rights subjects at New York University School of Law. He has degrees in law and economics from the University of Melbourne and a JSD from Berkeley. He previously taught at the European University Institute, the Australian National University, Harvard Law School, and the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy. He was one of the founders of both the European and the Australian and New Zealand Societies of International Law, and was editor-in-chief of the European Journal of International Law from 1996 through 2007. In 2014, he was appointed by the UN Human Rights Council as its special rapporteur on extreme poverty and human rights. From 2004 to 2010, he was UN Special Rapporteur on extrajudicial executions, undertaking official missions to Sri Lanka, Nigeria, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, the Philippines, Israel, Lebanon, Albania, Kenya, Brazil, Central African Republic, Afghanistan, and the United States. He has also been on the Independent International Commission on Kyrgyzstan and the UN Group of Experts on Darfur, and served as Special Advisor to the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights on the Millennium Development Goals, Chairperson and Rapporteur of the UN Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, and UNICEF's Senior Legal Advisor on Children's Rights. Please join me in welcoming UN Special Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty and Human Rights, Professor Philip Alston.
Well, first of all, I want to thank Jonathan and his co-chair Maya for all the work they've done to bring this together. I'm delighted to be here, and it's very reassuring that so many people at the Kennedy School and nearby are interested in issues relating to poverty and inequality. Obviously, I think that these are the most important issues on the agenda by far, but that's very much a minority view these days. The title of my address, and I'm not sure whether it was suggested by the organizers, it probably was, and I just looked at it recently and thought, oh, that's what I'm talking about, is Human Rights and the American Dream. So it is worth reflecting on the American Dream and the role that it's played, and I'd like to do that briefly before I start talking about more current issues. There are lots of versions of the American Dream, and if we had that fancy app that was used in the first talk this morning on homelessness, we could get all your views on what you associate with the American Dream, and I'm sure there'd be lots of meaningful confusion shown by that. Certainly, when I traveled through the US as Special Rapporteur 15 months ago, I met a very wide diversity of people Most of them clung strongly to the American dream. Some didn't. Some were disenchanted. Some were close to or beyond despair. But most of them were deeply into some version of the American dream. But it wasn't a dream of a yacht or a vacation home. It wasn't even a dream of full equality. It was basically access to what I would think of as fundamental rights. Access to mental and dental care, access to basic housing, and access to real educational opportunities for their children. That was the American dream for them. But it is worth stepping back and just putting the American dream into American history, at least those parts that I'm familiar with, in terms of the trajectory through discourse on rights. We can go back to Franklin Delano Roosevelt, 1944, his famous State of the Union address on a second Bill of Rights, an economic Bill of Rights. True individual freedom can't exist without economic security and independence. Necessitous men are not free men. People who are hungry, people who are out of a job, are the stuff of which dictatorships are made. That was Roosevelt. Can move forward to LBJ, the War on Poverty, and one of the most famous biographies on him is simply called Lyndon Johnson and the American Dream. Curiously, Johnson didn't actually use that phrase very often, but that was partly because a pesky individual named King had taken it up. Martin Luther King wrote from Birmingham prison in 1963 about the American dream. He wrote about the disinherited children of God who had sat down at lunch counters, who were in reality standing up for the best in the American dream. But by 1967, King had moved from demands for, as he put it, from civil rights to human rights. And the Poor People's Campaign that he launched, and which was supposed to march, which did eventually march in Washington in 1968, but only after he had been assassinated, had on its agenda a call for an end to poverty, full employment, a guaranteed income, and social housing. Many of us conveniently forget the economic part of his agenda, even though it's integral to the vision that he had for civil rights. But it's not convenient, of course, for the sanitized version of looking back at Martin Luther King as someone that we can all embrace, because, of course, the message was quite negative in terms of the main characteristics of American society that he demanded to be changed. I remember, it's not so long ago now, 2014, I was invited to the World Bank to give a talk on on the World Bank and human rights, basically. And just before I went down, the then president of the World Bank, Jim Yong Kim, gave a speech at Howard University where he trumpeted the fact that the World Bank was dedicated essentially to eliminating poverty and reducing global inequality. And he ended his speech, because it was at Howard University, which is a famous black university, and I suppose he felt he needed then to refer to someone of that colour. So he ended by saying that we in the World Bank, of course, are doing the work of Dr. King. We stand in lockstep with the agenda Dr. King laid out, he said. The only catch is that the World Bank will not use the term human rights, believes that to be political and therefore beyond its scope. So it's promoting development, it's promoting an end to poverty around the world, but it has to detach that from any reference to human rights. And it's very relevant, of course, to what we're looking at today, that one can talk endlessly about human rights in a very narrow sense, about an end to torture, an end to arbitrary arrests or extrajudicial killings. But if you don't include the broader economic and social agenda, it's a very partial notion of human rights, and it's certainly not one that is going to be effective even in promoting that other agenda, even if you only care about the struggle against racism or an end to arbitrary killings or the end to victimization of minority groups around the world. You must, or gender equality, you must factor in economic rights as an integral part of that agenda. To just finish up a very brief survey of the American dream in the US, by the 1980s, Ronald Reagan had turned the American dream around. He said the American dream is not that every man must be level with every other man, not that anyone ever said it was. The American dream is that every man must be free to become whatever God intends he should become. So there are two dimensions of that. Freedom is on your own, individual, no society. And secondly, it's God's will. It's not for the society to step in to try to shape the potential to facilitate. It's over to you, man and woman. These positions, interestingly enough, at least in my own work, were reflected very much in the international arena as well. Jonathan mentioned that many long years ago in 1987, the UN set up something called the Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, which was designed to oversee the obligations that 150 states around the world had undertaken under a treaty by that name, the so-called Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights. And in 1987, the big news, of course, was the Soviet Union eventually transforming into the perestroika, glasnost era, where the Soviet Empire disintegrated and was replaced. The first couple of years on the committee, I struggled valiantly with a couple of colleagues against the Soviet bloc, which was trying to prevent everything that I and some others really wanted to do about taking social rights seriously. But in the background of it all, bizarrely, was an equally important enemy, if I can put it in those terms, and that was the United States. There was a man that some of you may have heard of recently named Elliott Abrams, who led the charge. He was appointed as Assistant Secretary of State for Human Rights and immediately announced that the United States, which under Jimmy Carter had recognized the idea of social rights, no longer did so. These rights were dangerous, they could be subverted by communist and other regimes, and they were to be avoided. And the United States would henceforth stand up in many international forums that I was part of and object to any references to such rights and make statements like, look, we don't object to people having enough food to eat. You know, in fact, it's a good idea. It's an ideal, but it's not a human right. That's it. And the United States position was a constant in terms of efforts at the international level to try to broaden out the conception of human rights so that they didn't only include what are mistakenly referred to as negative rights, and were extended to a much more positive and inclusive version, understanding of what rights are really all about. Let me move forward then to 2017 and the visit that I undertook to the United States in my capacity as a special rapporteur. Firstly, a very brief word on this odd title of a special rapporteur. It's a fairly distinctive UN creation. I remember quite a few years ago now, I was at some dinner in Geneva with various ambassadors, and I started off saying that if we were going to make the system, as it's called, of special rapporteurs better known and understood, we should come up with terminology that was meaningful and move beyond this odd term. By the end of the dinner, I'd been completely convinced that I was wrong, and that it's much better to retain a lot of mystique about the term rather than clarifying it. And I think it certainly benefited me many times over the years when I ended up meeting with presidents of various countries, and of course they had no idea who the hell I was. I wasn't an ambassador, I wasn't a president or a prime minister, I wasn't some idiot academic from New York University, I was a special rapporteur. And it was useful. The origin of the term, very simply, is that when the UN started getting serious about human rights, which wasn't until sometime in the 1970s, what they really needed was some form of independent input, substantive input into the political debates that took place. They knew they wouldn't or couldn't get that from their own secretariat because that was too politically contested. And so the idea arose to appoint independent experts who are not paid, but who are appointed for their expertise and are then given certain authority to go around the world looking at particular issues and then reporting back to the Human Rights Council. The basic idea, of course, is to uphold some form of external accountability so that you have an independent expert who can act as a catalyst of some sort to debate. Special rapporteurs, as I've been told many times by presidents and many others, have no authority, have no power, are not able to change any policies. All they can do is report on what they see. So it's a determinedly soft exercise. But it has an important degree of reciprocity. And the United States has been very enthusiastic. So when I visited China, when I visited Saudi Arabia, for example, all in the last couple of years, the US was very happy. And the criticisms that resulted were endorsed or embraced. The US, of course, is a strong supporter of efforts undertaken by my colleagues, other special rapporteurs, looking at the situation in Iran, situation in North Korea, the situation of the Rohingyas in Myanmar. But of course, when it comes to the situation at home, although it has to be said, in fairness, that of course the United States is actually not all that different from most other countries. There was an Australian Prime Minister who once said, and it just repeats what's been said in Washington many times, that those idiots from the UN should know that we make policy for Australia in Canberra and not in Geneva or New York. And of course the answer to that is you're dead right. Go ahead, you make the policy. All I'm doing is trying to make some sort of input to suggest that perhaps that policy is not consistent with the human rights standards that you pretend to uphold internationally. So the responses to the report that I produced, and I'm not going to go over that report, I think some of you will have read it, and if you haven't, you're probably blessed. The report, actually I should say one word about it. The odd thing about a report like this and I'm very conscious of it as an academic, is that we have a very strict word limit. It's, of course, naturally, 10,700 words. And in that space, one can't do justice to anything much. And so I often found myself thinking, what a fraud I am on almost every topic, almost every second line of my report. I could recommend a really good book to you that's been written on just that topic and goes into it at great length. But of course the difference is that this sort of report, coming from a, quote, UN expert, has some sort of greater authority, if that's the right word. I'm not sure that it should be. It has to be looked at by the government concerned. It is looked at by a lot of other governments. And therefore, even though it's mainly only derivative in the sense of drawing upon the real work done by real researchers in the country itself, it can still have an impact. And that's why it's potentially important. So the responses to the report were interesting, and I'll just mention those briefly. The US State Department led off with a statement in Geneva officially, and they announced, and it was very gratifying to know that this was the case, that contrary to my report, there are actually only 250,000 people in extreme poverty in the United States, which is great, because I had thought there were 18.5 million. The 250,000 came from figures conjured up, basically, by the Heritage Foundation and then by the American Enterprise Institute, which decided that the formal Census Bureau statistics that everyone else and I had relied upon were completely misleading, and instead it should all be based on the Consumer Expenditure Survey. And that was the one that produced the miraculous figure that only 175 of 222,000 surveyed American households reported spending less than an extreme poverty threshold of $4 a day, which implies that there are only 250,000 people in extreme poverty. So that's good news. I think most of you should try. It's a bit like Soviet studies. It's finished, poverty studies. You've got to move on to something else. There's not enough people still living in poverty for you to worry about. Nikki Haley then, as Jonathan said that the report, well, first of all, patently ridiculous for the UN to waste time looking at the situation in the US, where the vast majority of people are not in poverty, and where public and private sector social safety nets, I love private sector social safety nets, I'm not sure what they are, it's probably Dunkin' Donuts, are firmly in place to help people in poverty. Instead, the UN should have studied poverty in the Congo, Burundi, or Venezuela. Well, thanks for that list, Nikki. It's very helpful. You'll be pleased to know that the UN is doing very detailed and constant studies of the situation in each of those countries, unlike the occasional visit to the United States. She then went on, but this should burnish my credentials now that we're all talking about socialism in the United States, to say that my report read like a socialist political manifesto of higher taxes, government-run healthcare, and decriminalising being poor. In brackets, never mind that nowhere in America is it a crime to be poor, she says. She then went on to basically say that we were wasting American tax dollars through the US and that the US should do something about that. Finally, the White House Council of Economic Advisors, contrary to the latest United Nations report, the vast majority of Americans are able to meet their basic human needs. And even better news, the report went on to declare that our war on poverty is largely over and a success. Yay! I don't know whether I should take the credit for that or whether it was brought on by other developments. Let me move then briefly to what I see as the way forward. And I'll mention just a couple of issues here. I won't go over the various recommendations in my report. The most important by far for me is the question of values, which I think we don't talk about often enough. It's quite a nice moment for me, I must say, to be in this particular room. I'm so old that I remember coming here in 1984 for a speech by a famous historian come philosopher named Quentin Skinner, with Tanner Lectures, big occasion. And it was very interesting. It was about all sorts of other issues, but he quite gratuitously ended the series of lectures by saying, and then we come to the UN Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which doesn't seem to understand what human rights are about at all, because it doesn't just confine itself to standard civil and political rights, but goes on and mentions this whole nonsensical list of economic and social rights. And he did what many conservatives have done in this country and elsewhere, and pulled out one particular right in the Universal Declaration, the most extreme formulation of which is that everyone has the right to holidays with pay. And the audience was meant to guffaw loudly at that as being absolute socialist nonsense or whatever, ignoring the fact, ignoring the biblical and very other deep origins of that idea, ignoring the fact that those who cannot afford to cease constant work for a brief period of time each week or whenever are not living a decent or human life, and instead saying that it's ludicrous to include these sorts of issues as human rights. So I think it's very important for us to actually come back and focus on values. I think that if we look at the evolution of United States economic and social policy over the years from, say, Johnson, but you might go back much further, to Trump, one of the most important things is precisely a change in values. It is the triumph, it's the move from the war on poverty to the triumph of market fundamentalism. Those are the values that inform today's society in the United States and in Australia, I should add, where I come from, and in most of the rest of the world. But the thing that we can't overlook is that this transformation was built largely on talk of values. While the progressive left was quiet, you can't mention social rights. You'll look like a socialist. Just talk about policy objectives. The conservatives were busily talking about individualism, the importance of rejecting the collectivity. There is, as Margaret Thatcher said, no such thing as society. We are all individuals. We are on our own. They were busy talking about patriotism. Ronald Reagan said one of the things I'm proudest of in the past 8 years is the resurgence of the new patriotism. But the new patriotism, as we know, and particularly, of course, in the US since 9/11, has been expropriated for a very particular agenda, which is not an agenda that has any interest in the elimination of poverty or in anything else to do with social rights. And finally, you've got talk of freedom, which is ubiquitous, of course, in the neoliberal agenda. I did a report on privatization earlier this year, which I sent to the UN General Assembly. And I have a quote in it from Mitch Daniels, former governor of Indiana, and I gather still the president of Purdue University. Anything that strengthens the private sector against the state is protective of personal freedom. If you think we're free under the reign of the tech giants and various other large corporations who have been empowered through the consistent privatization of formerly public functions to the private sector, I think one needs to think again. What we need then, in very simple terms, I think, is to start pushing back, to start redefining what we mean by freedom, what we mean by liberty, what we mean by community, what we mean by socialism, if that's suddenly going to become an issue thanks to the complete misinterpretation being put forward by the president and others these days. It was very interesting throughout the debate on Obamacare. Obama used the term right to health care once or twice and then backed off very quickly. He was told, don't go there, it's a loser. Sanders began to talk about healthcare as a right, and what we're seeing now, spontaneously from what I can tell, is at demonstrations, signs being held up, healthcare is a right. And it makes a huge difference to characterize something as a right. What you're doing is to empower an individual to say that even though you're born there or in those circumstances, or you're of that gender or of that race, you have a right to education and you have a right to health care. Whatever follows from that is another matter, but the recognition of the right is absolutely central. And to the extent that we exclude that from our efforts to defeat poverty, I think we do ourselves a great disservice. Second, of course, is to re-emphasize the importance of politics. I've said many times that poverty is a political choice. It is a political choice. Ironically, my report was presented in Washington on the same day as the Congress voted $1.5 trillion in tax cuts, with various people, the head of OMB and others, saying, you know what, we're going to have to tackle the deficit at some stage and we're going to have to rein in entitlements. So the entitlement side of the budget, Medicare, food stamps and a range of other provisions which are already quite inadequate, will have to be targeted in order to pay for the massive tax cuts that have been given to the very wealthy. So you had a very clear political choice made by the Congress to ignore the challenges of poverty, the extent of which is detailed in my report, and instead to spend vast amounts of money which they felt were available, moving the United States in the opposite direction in ways that can only promote further inequality and thus undermine, at least according to even the International Monetary Fund, economic growth, because at a certain point these degrees of inequality are incompatible with optimal economic growth. Poverty is not really a political issue still, I would say, in this country. There was a very interesting article in The Nation a week or two ago about the resistance by the Democratic National Committee to the establishment of a new poverty council all of last year within the Democratic Party. And as I say in my report, a senior Democratic politician said to me, you know, Mr. Alston, none of my colleagues talks about poverty. None of them goes to campaign rallies in really poor places. It's not of interest. They don't vote. We're not going to win that way. And he said that critically, I should add, but he was a fairly lone voice. I think it's only the people who can make poverty a political issue. I think the great advantage, if one can put it in those terms, of climate change, which we continue to largely ignore. You'll be pleased to hear that for every evil American policy on climate change, Australia can beat you. But that's going to be over shortly, because the cumulative effect of the climate changes that are taking place and the threats that those are going to pose, not to the poor will always be the worst off. The poor will certainly be the most heavily affected by climate change in every country in the world. But the fact that the middle classes and the wealthy are going to be hit by climate change very soon means that there is an opportunity for serious political realignment. And in that context, I think we need to make poverty an issue, but we need also to learn the other lesson, which is that we need to be persuasive. There isn't, certainly I think, in the United States, a strong constituency for poverty alleviation. And if you look at my report, you'll see that while I talk about the absolute indispensability of that, I try to relate it to what the United States talks of as the middle class. This is an amazing euphemism for anyone from outside the US, because of course it ain't the middle class, it's the working class and lower classes, but they don't want to be seen that way. And so they can conveniently separate their fate from that of the, quote, poor. But we have to make the point that there is heavy self-interest involved in creating a society that is less unequal, that is more equal, that provides healthcare to everyone just as it tries very hard and genuinely to provide education to everyone. And I think a new campaign does need to begin. I think healthcare is probably the key place. It brings me then, and I'll finish in just 1 minute, to the role of corporations, which I think is central in a lot of this. There's a nice headline in the New York Times today, the lead story, is healthcare and insurance industries mobilized to kill Medicare for all. That's the story of efforts to try to promote any sort of progressive social agenda. You've got a large range of corporate actors aligned against those sorts of initiatives. If you look at the response of American corporations to the rollback of environmental, health, and safety regulations over the last 2 years, if you can show me a major corporation that has spoken out strongly against the rollback of any of those regulations, I will be ecstatic, but I'll also be shocked. And despite the fact that each one of those regulations has come very reluctantly as a concession after huge scandals, large numbers of people being poisoned by toxic chemicals, large numbers being killed through other bad practices, have led to those regulations, and as they are now being slashed back, not a word from corporate interests. So again, we need to rethink the ways in which corporations are being regulated. That's coming up now in relation to technology, where suddenly the regulation-free zone that those companies have enjoyed for so long is being challenged, but we need to go beyond that. And I'll finish just on one point, which is simply the role of individuals, which means each of us. It is all about politics. It is all about what you choose to do in your own setting. We had the example this morning of Nadia, a 21-year-old powerhouse who's angry at a whole range of policies and practices, and so she should be. But we all need not just to be angry, but to be doing something. And it doesn't mean we should be on the barricades. It doesn't mean you even need to go and join some group that's politically active. But in what you do, whatever job it is, you can actually bring change to the values that inform that work. You can return the United States to the rhetoric that it once had, the war on poverty, the commitment that no American is both poor and free, and the commitment to a different sort of politics which really begins to eliminate poverty. Just one final word, one thing that I've been thinking about because it's been brought up quite often to me. People have said to me, haven't you read the Bible? Don't you know that Jesus said, the poor shall always be with you? And you know what? In some ways it's true. The poor will always be with us because there are always people in every society who are struck by misfortune, by disaster, by whatever, whether they can suffer in so many ways, and I've met so many of them in the United States and in other countries, people who were like me, people who were enjoying good health, things were going along smoothly, got a divorce, wife died, got some sort of illness, got hit by a car, whatever. Suddenly, life absolutely transformed. The poor shall always be with us. But the whole challenge of a decent society is to make sure that those who don't have their own means of income, who can't go out and get the sort of work that they need and deserve, are going to be looked after decently, not as a matter of charity, but as a matter of right. Thank you.
I think we have time for 1 or 2 questions. So if you have a question, there are mics here on either side. I would ask that you limit your question to 30 seconds or less and that you identify yourself before you ask your question. And if you already asked a question earlier today, please let someone else ask a question first because we're really short on time.
Is there anyone else?
Thanks.
Hi, thank you for this wonderful talk. Do you think that there is room for fighting poverty in capitalism, within capitalism? That's the question.
Let's take a number of questions. I think it's the best way to do it, yeah.
I was just wondering if you think essentially the way forward is social democracy, because like you said, people are talking about socialism, but it's not. It's the sort of social democracy that most of the rest of the developed world is used to.
Hi, this is rather specific, but I was wondering if you could speak to kind of your observations in your work in terms of the intersection between water quality and water access and poverty and inequality.
Hi, my name is Max. I'm part of the organizing team here. And, you know, if we want to solve the poverty issue, we definitely need to get resources for that, right, through taxes, let's say. And the rhetoric had been in the past years that it was the 1% that had to be taxed, but there is more and more research that said that's actually the upper middle class, the top 20% that should be taxed. Obama in 2015 tried, I mean, I'm not an expert on this, but tried removing the 5 to 9 college savings plan, something that was meant to help affluent families. And he was attacked from within the Democrat Party, Nancy Pelosi or Chris Van Hollen. So I wonder, is there really, like, what's the way forward to change the rhetoric that is not just that super rich 1%, but it's actually probably the people, you know, here that are part of the problem as well?
Thanks. Gosh, I hadn't thought of it in those terms. You're right, I'm against tax reform. Okay, so is it possible to fight poverty within the framework of capitalism? What's really interesting is that the whole idea of the welfare state And certainly its incarnation in the United Kingdom after World War II was designed very much just to humanize the capitalist system, to make it sustainable, to give it a human face, but in a genuine way. In other words, the assumption was that the capitalist system is the best way forward, and I don't think that I'm ready to abandon that yet, but I don't think the capitalist system means the system that we have right now of essentially uncontrolled corporate power, of corporations that really don't pay any taxes, Amazon getting a rebate of 130 million or whatever it was. I think that there is a possibility for a welfare state, if that's the old-fashioned term that we want to use, within a capitalist society, but we need not to take capitalism for what we currently have today. Is social democracy the way forward? Yes. I mean, I think the conflation of Venezuela with socialism is just sort of ludicrous. One wouldn't even bother reading such an article unless it were apparently capable of being taken seriously by some people, and I think we're going to hear a lot more of it. But there's clearly no relationship with a system that essentially is a kleptocracy in many respects in Venezuela, masquerading as a system for the people, and what any of us think of as a socialist or social democratic system. The relationship between water quality and water access and poverty, it sounds to me as though you know more about this than I do, but obviously it's very close. One of the reasons that I wrote my report on privatization a few months ago is precisely because I think we do need to move back to some notion of public goods, whereby governments are responsible either for providing or for meaningfully regulating and ensuring that access is universal when it comes to these very basic goods. And so water is clearly one of the key challenges there. In terms of taxation, of course I agree with you. I think there is too much of an easy focus on the 1%. I think that taxation is something that needs to be shared around. For me, it comes back to a very important dimension, though, which is the need to persuade, because I made the joke that maybe I've changed my mind, because obviously we all have self-interests, and if you're going to say to me, hey, Fat Cat University professor, you're suddenly going to be paying an extra 10%, even I will want to know, well, what am I going to get for that 10%? And I think we need to start, a lot of the stuff that's in my report points to what I see as the bankrupting of American society in many respects. In other words, the draconian cap on taxes at the state level in particular, which then leads to the decimation of public services, which then leads to the system of fines and fees, primarily on minorities and poor people, in order to get basic government money, is just a disgrace and an outrage. And the fact that we haven't been able to call attention to that and say this is a shameful system, this couldn't be what America stands for, this couldn't be what our values are, but that fight needs to be fought rather than saying, well, here's the range of people that we're going to soak in terms of taking more taxes. But you can't have a decent society without decent taxation. That's all there is to it. Finito? Yeah? Okay.
Yep. Good. Thank you, Professor Alston. And let's have another round of applause for that and for answering those questions. We're now